Poor girl took a homeless man home not knowing he was a billionaire CEO. What he did shocked everyone. Before we begin, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Mariana rushed through the city streets, her heart pounding against her chest as if it too could feel the weight of her nerves. Her crumpled resume clutched tightly in one hand, and a small bag of food in the other, she dashed toward the building where her job interview was supposed to take place. She had done everything she could to prepare, but now, in this moment, it felt like none of it mattered. Her hair was hastily tied back, and she could feel the sweat starting to form on the back of her neck. It was one of those days where everything felt just a little off. She decided to take a shortcut through a narrow alley, hoping to make up some lost time. The ground was wet, papers littering the ground, some torn and half-drenched, adding a slippery layer of danger to her every step. She had no time to slow down, not now, not when she was so close. But in a split second, her foot slipped, and she was thrown off balance. The bag of food flew out of her hand, and before she could react, she crashed to the ground, the sound of rice and chicken scattering like confetti in the air. Perfect, she muttered under her breath, sitting there in the alley, staring at her ruined lunch. She felt like she had lost so much more than just food. The frustration built up inside her, tightening her chest. The job interview was slipping further away by the second. Then, as if the universe was playing some cruel joke on her, a voice cut through the silence. "Are you hurt?" Startled, Mariana looked up. From behind a stack of cardboard boxes in the corner of the alley, a man appeared. He was clearly homeless, his clothes ragged and worn, his hair unkempt and his face covered with a scruffy beard. But there was something in his eyes that immediately caught her attention, something calm and sharp, like a depth that didn't quite match his rough appearance. "I think I'm okay," Mariana answered, her voice barely more than a whisper as she bent to pick up what was left of her meal. The man stepped closer, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "There's still a little left," he said, handing her the battered container she had dropped. Mariana hesitated for a moment, but then, almost out of instinct, she took it from him. His touch was gentle, careful. "Do you live here?" she asked, her curiosity piqued by his odd presence in the alley. "For now, yes," he replied, his gaze moving around the alley. "But it's temporary. I'm between two paths, who I was and who I will be." Mariana stared at him, the words he used felt strangely poetic for someone in his situation. She wondered what kind of life he had led, what kind of person he had once been. Then she noticed something else, the man's foot. There was a nasty, bleeding wound on it, the kind that needed more care than just a passing glance. "You're hurt," she said, her voice filled with concern. "It's nothing," he replied, brushing it off, though his face twisted slightly in discomfort. "I'm used to it." Without thinking, Mariana opened her backpack and pulled out a small bottle of alcohol, some tissues, and a roll of tape. "This will sting a little," she warned. "I've had worse," he said, trying to sound tough, but his face contorted when the alcohol touched his skin. Mariana could see the pain in his eyes, but she didn't let it stop her. She carefully bandaged the wound, her hands steady despite the unexpected turn her day had taken. Just as she finished, her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that her lunch, now ruined, was the least of her problems. She sighed. "Well, that's just perfect. Lost my lunch, running late, and now I'm helping someone worse off than me," she muttered, the frustration evident in her voice. Nick, the man she just helped, chuckled softly, pulling a bag of bread from his jacket. "I have a bag of bread," he said, holding it out to her. "Want some?" Mariana raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Only if there's butter," she replied, a hint of a smile breaking through her earlier annoyance. The two of them sat on the curb, sharing the bread in a quiet moment of camaraderie. For a brief second, it felt like they were friends, even though they had just met. It was a strange connection, one that neither of them could explain. Mariana glanced at her watch, realizing with a sinking feeling that she was already too late for her interview. The whole thing had been a waste of time, and yet, here she was, sitting in an alley with a man who, despite his rough exterior, had somehow made her feel like everything would be okay. Well, she sighed, standing up and brushing the crumbs off her clothes. That's it. No job, no lunch, and now I'm wasting time with a mysterious man who has strangely beautiful eyes. Nick's gaze locked onto hers for a moment, his expression unreadable. You think my eyes are beautiful? Mariana blushed, suddenly feeling embarrassed. She quickly changed the subject. What's your name? Nick, he replied simply. Mariana, she said, offering him a smile, though her mind was still buzzing with questions. So, you really live on the streets? Nick nodded slowly, his face shadowed by something more than just the circumstances he found himself in. Technically, yes. But my roof is the sky. That must be hard, Mariana said, her voice soft. Nick didn't answer. Instead, he just sat there, staring into the distance as if lost in thought. Mariana stood, brushing off her clothes and picking up her crumpled resume. Good luck, Nick, she said, offering him a warm smile before turning to leave. You too, Mariana, he called after her. As she walked away, Mariana couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't seen the last of Nick. Something about him, something in the way he carried himself, tugged at her heart. She didn't know why, but she felt an inexplicable connection to him. Over the following days, Mariana found herself passing through the alley more and more often. She was always in a rush, always running after the next interview, always chasing a dream that seemed just out of reach. But Nick was always there, sitting in the same spot, his calm and observant gaze never leaving her. Sometimes they exchanged greetings, sometimes brief conversations. Once, he complimented her courage for standing up to a rude street vendor, and for the first time in ages, she smiled, feeling like someone had truly seen her. His presence, no matter how small, had become a steady part of her chaotic, fast-paced life. Then, one cold afternoon, everything changed. Mariana walked through the alley, still reeling from another disappointing interview. But when she saw Nick, something was different. He looked worse, his face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his hands were trembling as he huddled against the cold. The bandage she had put on his foot was still there, but now it was dirty, barely holding together. The wound had worsened, and Mariana could see that he was too weak to even sit upright. She walked over, her heart sinking in her chest. Nick, she said softly. You still have that bandage on. He looked up at her, his weak smile hardly a smile at all. It's still holding, he said, his voice shaky. But I'm used to it. Mariana knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she inspected the wound. It was worse than she had feared, infected, swollen, and in desperate need of medical attention. She looked around the alley, her mind racing. She knew it wasn't the safest choice, but something inside her told her to trust him. I have a place, she whispered, almost to herself. It's small, but it's warm. Just for tonight, okay? Nick looked at her, surprise and caution in his eyes. Are you sure? It's just for tonight, Mariana repeated, her voice firm. I can't leave you out here like this. For a moment, he hesitated, but then, as if he couldn't fight it any longer, he nodded. She reached out her hand, and he took it. Even with a limp, Nick carried himself with an air of dignity, as though nothing could break the spirit inside him. Mariana couldn't explain it, but it intrigued her. There was something about him, something more than just his rough exterior, something more than the pain and struggle he had endured. When they reached her small apartment, Mariana opened the door with a slight smile. Welcome to my castle, she said, trying to lighten the mood. Ignore the mess and the smell of disinfectant. Nick stepped inside slowly, his gaze moving around the small space. He stopped in front of a framed photo on the wall, a picture of an older woman, smiling brightly, standing next to Mariana. "Your mother?" Nick asked, his voice soft. "My grandmother," Mariana replied, her tone tinged with sadness. "She's in the hospital this week. I take care of her." Nick touched the glass of the frame, his eyes lingering on the photo as if the woman reminded him of someone from his own past. "She reminds me of someone I once knew," he murmured, so quietly that Mariana barely heard it. A chill ran down her spine, but she didn't press him further. She led him to the small back room, her voice steady despite the unease she felt. "This is the bedroom. The bathroom's at the end of the hall. Towels are in the cabinet, and watch out for the heater, it's a little old. Don't get too comfortable, okay? It's just for tonight." Nick nodded, his gaze lingering on the space for a moment. "Just for tonight," he repeated, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. That night, neither of them slept well. Nick lay awake, his mind far away, caught between his past and the present. Mariana, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something big, something she wasn't ready for, but couldn't stop. "Had potential," Nick said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "And I couldn't let you miss out on it. You deserve better." Mariana stood in the doorway, her mind racing. She had seen Nick's intelligence in bits and pieces, the way he spoke about things, how he seemed to know a little bit about everything, but this? This was something else. She felt a mix of gratitude and confusion. How could someone who had nothing, someone who claimed to be living on the streets, know so much about making resumes and job opportunities? How could he have the skills to improve something as personal as her resume, without asking? She exhaled slowly, trying to push her thoughts into order. "Nick," she began, her voice carefully measured, "you should have asked me first. But I don't know, maybe you're right. Maybe I was selling myself short." She looked at him, trying to read his expression. But as usual, he remained an enigma, that quiet, almost detached look in his eyes making it hard to figure him out. "People like you don't belong on the sidelines," Nick continued, looking at her with an intensity that almost made her uncomfortable. "You just need the right opportunity to show what you're really capable of." Mariana felt her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure why, but his words made something inside her stir. She had always doubted her own worth, always thought she wasn't good enough. But here he was, this stranger, believing in her more than she had ever believed in herself. "Thanks," she said softly, stepping back from the door. "I guess I'll see where this takes me. But next time, just ask first." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I will. I promise." The following days passed in a blur of interviews, deliverables, and life's usual chaos. Mariana found herself adjusting to the rhythm of sharing her apartment with Nick. It was strange, but in a way, comforting. He was always there, quietly doing things, fixing the little things around the apartment, like a forgotten lamp or a crooked picture frame. He never asked for anything in return, never complained. And every now and then, when Mariana needed a break from the constant grind of her life, she would sit down and talk to him. Those moments were strange, too. He would speak in vague terms, saying things like, "I've been in worse places," or, "I've learned to adapt." But the more time she spent with him, the more she felt like there was a piece of him that didn't quite match the story he told. One evening, as Mariana walked into the apartment after yet another frustrating day, she noticed something odd. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. She looked around and saw that the living room wall, which had always been dull and chipped, now had a fresh coat of paint. Nick was standing near the window, looking out at the city with that same unreadable expression. "Nick, did you?" Mariana trailed off, unsure of how to phrase her question. "Did you paint the wall?" Nick turned around, his face neutral as ever. "Yes. It seemed like it needed it. The place needed a little change." Mariana blinked, unsure of what to say. It wasn't the kind of thing a man living on the streets would think about, let alone do. He didn't even seem to own anything besides the clothes on his back. And yet here he was, adding his touch to her home without asking. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. "You don't need to do that," she said slowly, watching him. "It's just a wall." Nick met her gaze. "Sometimes, it's the little things that make the biggest difference." The days turned into weeks. Nick continued to live in Mariana's small apartment, his presence somehow becoming part of the routine. He never stayed in one place for too long. His movements were measured, like he was always on guard, always waiting for something to happen. And Mariana couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. It wasn't just the way he could fix anything with a few tools. It wasn't even the way he seemed to know things he had no business knowing. It was the way he never seemed truly content. His eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, always seemed distant, as though he was holding something back. Mariana continued her job search, the days slipping by in a haze of interviews, hopes, and letdowns. The one company that had invited her for an interview had rejected her, citing better qualified candidates. Mariana was used to the disappointment, but it stung just the same. Her dreams of a better life seemed more distant than ever. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Mariana came home to find Nick in the kitchen again, this time preparing a simple dinner. It wasn't much, just rice and beans, but it smelled good. As she sat down at the table, she noticed the way his hands moved with quiet efficiency, like he had done this thousands of times before. His movements were smooth, practiced, and the more she watched him, the more she felt that creeping sense of unease. "What's going on with you, Nick?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. He stopped stirring the pot, his back stiffening slightly. "You never talk about your past. You always avoid it. And you do things that don't make sense for someone like you. You can cook, you can fix things, you even know how to update resumes. People on the street don't have those skills. So why are you pretending to be someone you're not?" Nick didn't look at her right away. Instead, he continued stirring the rice, his face unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I'm not pretending to be anyone," he said, his words heavy with something Mariana couldn't quite place. "I'm just trying to survive. But sometimes, survival requires more than just the basics. It requires playing a part." Mariana's heart raced. There was something about his tone that sent a chill down her spine. She stared at him, searching his face for some sign, some clue. But he didn't give her anything. His eyes were unreadable, and his expression was calm, almost too calm. She couldn't let it go. "What do you mean by that? What's your real story, Nick?" For the first time, Nick's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite catch. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that same guarded look. "I'll tell you one day," he said softly. "But not today. Maybe not ever. Not yet." Mariana felt a wave of frustration wash over her. But she didn't push him any further. There was something in his voice that told her it wasn't the right time, and maybe, just maybe, she wasn't ready to hear the truth yet. The next morning, Mariana left the apartment early, trying to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The events of the night before played over and over in her mind as she walked to her next interview. But the more she thought about Nick, the more she realized that she was seeing him in a new light. He wasn't just a homeless man. He wasn't just some random guy who had wandered into her life. He was something more, something she couldn't quite figure out. By the time she returned home later that day, she was exhausted, mentally and emotionally. She stepped into the apartment, ready to collapse on the couch and forget about everything for a while. But what she found when she walked into the living room made her heart skip a beat. Nick was standing by the window, looking out at the city. His back was to her, but there was something about his posture, something about the way he stood, that made her feel like he was holding a secret, something he was desperate to keep hidden. "Nick," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond immediately. And when he finally turned to face her, his expression was different. There was a coldness in his eyes now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "You're not who you say you are you?" Mariana asked, her voice trembling. She hadn't meant to say it, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. Nick didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the window, his gaze fixed on the distant skyline. For a moment, Mariana thought he wasn't going to say anything at all. But then, in a low, almost inaudible voice, he spoke. "Sometimes," he said, his voice distant, "survival requires sacrifices." And with that, Mariana knew she hadn't imagined it. Something was happening. Something big. And Nick, the quiet, mysterious man she had let into her life, was at the center of it all. Nick Allen Carr's disappearance remains a mystery, the same name, the same man, the same face. Mariana felt her heart tighten as she read the words. She could barely breathe. It was like everything she thought she knew was slipping away from her, twisting into something unrecognizable. Was this the same Nick who had been living in her apartment, quietly fixing things around the house, cooking meals for her? Could it really be him, the missing CEO of Harvan Technologies? Her mind raced as she quickly handed the vendor a few bills for the newspapers. She needed answers. She needed to know the truth, even if she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. Mariana walked home, the stack of old newspapers pressed tightly to her chest, her head spinning with questions. Her thoughts were tangled, and every time she tried to make sense of it, everything became more confusing. She had to confront him, there was no other way. When she walked in, Nick was in the living room, casually flipping through a book. The normalcy of it all made her feel even more unsettled. He didn't seem to have any idea that his entire world was about to come crashing down around him. The man she'd been living with, the man who had fixed her broken lamp and cleaned her apartment, was the same person who had vanished from the headlines months ago. How was that even possible? She walked into the room, her eyes locked on him. Nick looked up, his usual calm smile on his face. "Hey," he greeted, as if everything were perfectly normal. "Nick," she started, her voice trembling slightly, though she fought to keep it steady, "we need to talk." Nick's eyes shifted ever so slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. He simply closed the book, placed it on the table, and stood up, his expression unreadable. "What's on your mind?" Mariana took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The newspapers in her bag felt like they were burning a hole in her chest, and the weight of the questions she needed to ask felt almost unbearable. "I saw something today," she said, her voice quiet. "Something about you." Nick didn't flinch. He just waited, his gaze steady on hers. "What did you see?" She pulled the stack of newspapers from her bag and handed them to him. His eyes flicked over the headlines, and for a brief moment, Mariana saw something shift behind his calm exterior. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. "Nick Allen Carr," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Is that you?" The silence in the room was thick, heavy with tension. Nick's gaze remained fixed on the papers, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. Mariana felt her breath catch in her throat. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, barely able to hold back the surge of anger, confusion, and hurt that flooded her chest. "Who are you really, Nick?" He finally looked up at her, his eyes still guarded but no longer as distant. There was something in his gaze now, something deeper. "I'm the same person you've been living with," he said, his voice low. "Nothing's changed. But you're not just a guy living on the streets," Mariana stammered, her voice shaking with the weight of her discovery. "You're a CEO. You've been hiding, lying. Why? What is all of this? Why are you here, pretending to be someone you're not?" Nick didn't move. He didn't break eye contact. For a long moment, Mariana stood there, waiting for him to answer. But he just stared at her, as though weighing whether or not to reveal the truth. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't want to get you involved. Not in this." "Not in what?" Mariana's frustration was bubbling up now. "In what, Nick? You've been living here, in my home, and you didn't think I had the right to know who you really are?" He sighed, the weight of his words pressing down on him. "It's complicated. I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to understand something. This isn't just about me. There are things at play here, things that you don't know about." Mariana's mind raced. "So what? You think I'm just supposed to sit back and let you keep pretending? Let you keep lying to me?" Nick's eyes flickered with something, guilt, maybe. But then it was gone. He stood up and walked towards the window, his back to her. "I never meant to lie to you. But sometimes, you have to play a role to survive. You have to make choices that protect you, protect the people you care about." He paused, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. "And you don't always get to decide who you are, Mariana." Mariana watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't process everything he was saying. There was a part of her that wanted to shout at him, to demand the truth, but there was another part, one that was scared of what the truth might mean. She wasn't sure if she could handle whatever Nick was hiding. "You've been living with me," she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "How long? How long have you been here, in my apartment, lying to me? And all this time, I've been thinking you were just a guy who needed help." Nick didn't turn around. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched. "I didn't lie about that. I needed help. But I also needed to stay out of the spotlight. People are looking for me, Mariana. People who don't want me to be found. And if they find out I'm here, I don't know what will happen. To me. To you." Mariana's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't thought about that. She hadn't thought about the danger he could bring into her life. "Who's looking for you, Nick? Who are these people? What is going on?" Nick was silent again, his back still turned to her. For a long moment, Mariana thought he wasn't going to answer, that he would stay silent and leave her in the dark. But then he finally spoke, his voice softer this time, as though he was making a decision, one that had weighed heavily on him. "They took over my company," he said quietly, his words heavy with something Mariana couldn't quite place. "Victor Alden. He's the one who pushed me out. Took control. And now he's slowly dismantling everything I built. They're doing things, bad things, Mariana. Things that could ruin everything." Mariana took a step closer, her mind struggling to make sense of what he was saying. "So you've been running from them? Hiding?" Nick nodded, finally turning to face her. His eyes were tired, darker than she'd ever seen them. "It's not just about me, Mariana. It's about what they're doing. The things they're getting away with. I need to stop it, before it's too late." Mariana didn't know what to say. She had no idea what to make of this new information. Everything had shifted in the span of a few minutes. The man she thought she knew, the quiet, humble Nick, was somehow caught up in something much bigger than she could have imagined. "I never wanted to pull you into this," Nick said, his voice strained. "But now that you know, now that you've seen who I really am, you have a choice. You can walk away. Or you can stay and help me fix it." Mariana felt her world tilt on its axis. Everything was changing. And she had no idea what to do next. But somehow, deep down, she knew this was far from over. The man standing in front of her wasn't just a stranger in her life, he was a part of something much bigger. And no matter how much she wanted to ignore it, she was already too involved. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Mariana walked back home. Her mind was still spinning from the events of the night. The elegant ballroom, the sight of Nick, no, Daniel, walking among people who seemed to know him as if he belonged there. It didn't make sense. Why had he been hiding in plain sight? Why was he pretending to be someone else? Her thoughts swirled like a storm, and the ground beneath her felt as if it had shifted, throwing everything she thought she knew about Nick into question. It was as though she had crossed some invisible line, and now everything felt uncertain. Nick, the man who had been living in her apartment, helping her with small things, being the quiet, kind figure she had grown accustomed to, was now someone entirely different. And Mariana wasn't sure if she could trust him anymore. When she finally walked through the door, the house was eerily quiet. She didn't even hear the hum of the refrigerator or the faint tapping of Nick's fingers on the table, as she had grown used to. She paused, taking in the stillness, and then, there he was. Nick sat casually on the couch, looking almost relaxed, like he hadn't been the one slipping through the corridors of the hotel pretending to be someone else. Nick turned to her, his gaze unreadable. "I don't know what's next, Mariana. But maybe now I have a reason to go back." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Mariana's heart raced. There it was again, something she couldn't quite grasp, some hidden truth that Nick was not sharing with her. But she couldn't deal with it now. She had to get away, to think, to breathe. Without saying anything, she turned and headed straight to her room, leaving Nick behind, still sitting on the couch. Nick, meanwhile, didn't move. His eyes lingered on the old photo of Mariana's grandmother hanging on the wall. He studied it as if it held some answer he needed, as though the image could shed light on the situation he now found himself in. He thought about fate, the way it could be cruel and fair all at once. Mariana, too, had been affected by his choices, but Nick wasn't sure how much longer he could stay in the shadows. He knew his past was catching up with him, and there were only so many lies he could tell before they unraveled completely. As the following week unfolded, Mariana tried her best to focus on her work, even though everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. She was still waiting to hear back from Salvarez about the job interview, but in the meantime, she took on small tasks to stay busy. She worked as a waitress at events on the weekends, delivered packages whenever she had time, and even helped neighbors type resumes for a little extra cash. She kept herself moving, her mind occupied, but no matter how hard she tried, Nick's secret life, his hidden identity, kept pressing on her thoughts. Then, on Friday morning, a message popped up on her phone. It was from one of her co-workers. "Party tonight. Big tech company event. Are you in?" Mariana didn't hesitate. Her fingers typed the word yes before she could second-guess herself. She didn't know it at the time, but that one simple decision would change everything. That evening, Mariana arrived at the venue, an extravagant hotel with a sleek mirrored facade that gleamed under the lights. The lobby was grand, with chandeliers hanging like crystal raindrops, and the kind of opulence Mariana was used to seeing in movies, not in real life. She was handed a standard uniform and quickly ushered into the main hall. The coordinator, in a frantic rush, handed her a tray of glasses and gave her a simple instruction: don't talk to guests unless absolutely necessary. Smile. Just smile. Mariana took a deep breath and entered the hall, trying to steady her nerves. The atmosphere was filled with chatter, the sound of laughter, and the soft hum of corporate presentations projected onto enormous screens. The room was buzzing with activity, with well-dressed men and women talking about their businesses, their success. In the corner, an orchestra played a soft melody, adding to the surreal, almost dreamlike quality of the event. Mariana carried her tray through the crowd, trying to keep her posture poised as she maneuvered around guests, offering them champagne. But then, something caught her eye, something that stopped her dead in her tracks. Nick. But it wasn't Nick, at least, not in the way she knew him. No, this man was wearing a suit, clean-shaven, standing tall among a group of well-dressed men. He looked entirely different. Gone was the scruffy, disheveled appearance. Gone was the quiet, humble man she'd shared a roof with. He was someone else. His confidence was palpable as he spoke to the group, gesturing with authority, clearly fitting in with people who had no idea who he really was. Mariana's heart skipped a beat, her breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to walk away, to pretend she hadn't seen him. But something stopped her, something deep inside her that screamed at her to confront him. Instead, she quickly stepped aside and slipped into a nearby hallway to catch her breath. She had to calm herself. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She looked again. This time, Nick, or Daniel, was laughing with an older man. Both of them held glasses of champagne, chatting like old friends. And that was when Mariana noticed it, his name tag. It read Daniel Andrade. Her heart dropped. She didn't know what to think. Her mind swirled with confusion, but one thing was clear. This man, this Daniel, was not the same person who had shared her home. He was someone else entirely. Mariana's thoughts were interrupted when she had to go back to work. She hurried into the back room, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. But as she reached for her phone to send a message to her coworker, the coordinator called her away. She quickly left her phone on the counter, not thinking much of it, as she rushed back into the event. Minutes later, when she returned, her phone was gone. Panic shot through her. She searched the entire back room, asked every staff member, but no one had seen anything. It was as if her phone had vanished into thin air. Then, standing near the entrance, trying to steady her breathing, Mariana spotted him. Daniel, Nick, slipping quietly through a side door. And that was when she saw it. A metallic edge poking out of his jacket pocket. It looked like a phone. Mariana's pulse quickened. She didn't have time to confront him. He was already disappearing down the hallway, vanishing into the crowd. That night, she returned home without her phone and without answers. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, and the unease in her stomach had grown into something far worse. What was Nick hiding? Who was he really? Nick didn't return until past midnight. He entered the apartment quietly, thinking Mariana was asleep. But she wasn't. She had been sitting in the living room, waiting. "You're late," Mariana said, her voice cold but steady. Nick hesitated, standing in the doorway. He didn't meet her gaze at first, but then, with a deep sigh, he stepped into the room. "I went for a walk," he said, the words almost too casual. "A walk?" Mariana's voice was sharp. "At a 5-star hotel, wearing a suit, and a fake name tag?" Nick didn't flinch. His face remained calm, almost unreadable. "I had to be there," he replied quietly. "Stealing a phone was part of the plan, too." Mariana's anger flared. "You stole my phone?" Nick held it up, pulling it from his jacket pocket. "I didn't steal it. I found it. Near the buffet. I was going to return it, but then I changed my mind." "Changed your mind?" Mariana's voice wavered with frustration. "Changed your mind about returning it, or about keeping up your lies?" Nick remained composed, handing her the phone. "Here it is. Battery's full. Nothing's been touched." Mariana stood, glaring at him. "You were pretending to be someone else again, Nick. You lied to everyone at that event. You lied to me. You made me look like a fool." "It wasn't about you," Nick said, his voice lowering. "It was about getting the information I needed." Mariana took a step forward, her chest tight with emotion. "And what did you find out, Nick?" He paused, taking a deep breath before he spoke. "Victor is planning to sell Harvin. A merger with a fake company. On paper, it'll look legitimate. But it's all a cover-up. He's using my name on old contracts that haven't been deactivated yet." Mariana's mind raced. "So why don't you report him?" Nick's face tightened. "I don't have enough proof yet. And if I make a move too soon, he'll turn it all around, make himself look like the victim. Mariana paced the room, her hands shaking. So that's it? You've been living here, lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, and all for what? To bring down Victor? Nick's expression softened, but he didn't break his silence. He knew what Mariana was feeling, betrayed, confused. But this wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about Harvan Technologies. It was about something deeper. Something he couldn't yet explain. I'm both the man who messed up, he said quietly, and the man trying to make things right. Mariana felt her world tilt again. Could she trust him? Could she believe him after everything? I need to think, she said, her voice breaking. Without another word, she turned and walked to her room, closing the door behind her. Nick stood there for a moment, the phone still in his hand. Then, without a word, he left the room. The next morning, Mariana woke up, her mind in turmoil. She made coffee, but her hands trembled as she held the cup. She didn't call Nick. He was already up and dressed, standing by the door. I'll be gone for a few days. Every document she read felt like a key unlocking deeper layers of a dangerous game. The more she dug into Victor's files, the clearer it became, he was methodically dismantling Harvan from the inside. Like an old toy, the company was being torn apart piece by piece, and Victor had ensured every document, every transaction, left no room for doubt. Contracts had been signed in Nick's name, massive asset transfers were moving through shell companies, and it was all being kept under wraps with alarming precision. But Mariana wasn't fooled. This wasn't just about the money, it was about Victor's calculated effort to cover his tracks, to avoid any scandal that could be traced back to him. He had left gaps in the records, intentionally created loopholes, documents signed with digital signatures that looked legitimate at first glance, and used front men to shield the truth. He knew exactly what he was doing. Mariana's heart raced as she went through the files, knowing that what she was holding in her hands was just the tip of the iceberg. But what could she do with it? It wasn't enough to expose him yet. Not even close. She was already in too deep, and there was no turning back. The silence of the room weighed on her as she took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in her mind. She had to act, but how? The deeper she dug, the more dangerous it became. After a long pause, she couldn't ignore the urgency of the situation anymore. She had to make a decision. Without thinking twice, she typed a simple message to Nick, "We need to talk today. Wherever you are." She stared at the screen, waiting for his response. Time seemed to stretch, and the silence that followed felt like an eternity. Every passing second made her feel more and more like she was teetering on the edge of something big, something she could not walk away from. Nick, meanwhile, was sitting in a dimly lit co-working space downtown, his eyes scanning over a screenshot of an altered contract. He was using a fake identity to access servers and store files in an encrypted system. His phone buzzed, and when he saw the message from Mariana, he didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he left the place without a word to anyone. When he arrived at Mariana's place, she was standing outside, waiting for him. There was no anger in her eyes now. Only resolve. A quiet strength radiated from her as she met his gaze. Her expression was steady, but different. The storm was gone, and in its place, there was a calm that made Nick's stomach tighten. "Come in," she said, her voice low but firm. Nick stepped inside, the familiar narrow hallway now feeling like a path to an unknown destination. He noticed the subtle shift in the air, the unspoken tension between them. They both knew things were changing, but neither was sure where it would lead. She pointed to the couch. "Sit," she instructed. He obeyed without protest. Mariana took a deep breath, holding the documents in her hands like they were the only things grounding her to reality. "I saw everything," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with the weight of what she had discovered. "I read the documents. I watched the videos. You're right, Nick. Victor is tearing Harvin apart, but, she hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully, but you're trying to do this alone. And that's not going to work. It's too dangerous. Nick remained silent, his eyes lowered, conflicted. He knew she was right. He had tried to protect her from all of this, but in doing so, he had only dragged her deeper. Now there was no turning back. I know, he finally said, his voice heavy. I don't want to drag you into this any more than I already have. Mariana didn't flinch. She wasn't backing down. You already have, she replied calmly. And now I'm here. There's no turning back. Nick looked at her, searching her face, his expression torn. So what do you suggest? Mariana's gaze hardened as she picked up a folder from the table. Salvarez called me yesterday, she said. They offered me a temporary IT support position. They have contracts with several companies, including one of the front companies you've mentioned in your documents. One that's receiving money from Harvin. Nick looked up at her, his attention now fully on her words. You think you can get something from them? I can get inside, Mariana said, her voice unwavering. It won't be easy, but if I can access their internal systems, I might be able to find more direct evidence, calls, transfers, authorizations, all under Victor's name. Nick's face darkened. Mariana, this could put you in danger. Mariana stood tall, her eyes locking with his. I've been in danger since the day I brought you home. Nick took a step closer, his hand almost instinctively reaching out to her arm. You don't have to do this for me, he said quietly. I'm not doing it for you, Mariana answered, her voice firm. I'm doing it for justice. For truth. For everyone who's been deceived. Nick paused, his heart heavy with the weight of what she was saying. I don't know if I deserve all of this. Mariana's gaze softened for a moment, but her voice remained steady. Then don't try to deserve it. Just make it worth it. Over the next few days, Mariana started her new job at Salvarez. The company was sleek and modern, with tight security protocols and a strict culture. But Mariana knew how to play the part. She kept her head down, acted like a quiet, helpful employee, and used every opportunity to gather information. But behind those watchful eyes, she had a single goal: to find the loose threads that would connect Salvarez to Victor's scheme. Meanwhile, Nick worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He had enlisted the help of Marcos, an old trusted contact and former director of digital security at Harvin. Together, they set up a parallel data collection system to gather information at an unprecedented speed. The walls were closing in, and the plan was coming together. There's a meeting scheduled for next week, Marcos said, showing Nick an intercepted email. It's between Victor and the directors of the ghost companies. At the Magnolia Hotel. A private hall. The event is titled, Strategic Merger. Nick's eyes narrowed as he read the email. He knew exactly what that meant. If that contract was signed, it would be the final nail in the coffin, and he would lose any chance of stopping Victor. The night before the meeting, Mariana made a breakthrough. During a break, she accessed Salvarez's internal system and found a hidden file. One that contained recordings of meetings between Victor and executives from the shell companies. The conversations were clear, the voices distinct. There were details about payments, agreements, and the use of Nick's documents. She saved everything onto a flash drive, hidden deep inside her bag. Her heart raced as she walked out of the building, feeling like she was carrying a bomb that could explode at any moment. She was on edge, but there was no turning back. That night, she met Nick. I got it, she said, handing him the flash drive. Nick took it from her carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. You took a huge risk. It was worth it, Mariana replied. Nick plugged the flash drive into his laptop. The screen flickered, then displayed a list of audio files. He clicked play, and Victor's voice filled the room. He won't show up, Victor's voice said, cold and confident. And even if he does, the story's already been written. He ran. He disappeared. The world forgot about him. Another voice spoke, one of the executives. The merger happens this week. After that, no one will ask about him again. Nick's jaw clenched. This was it. With this evidence, they had everything they needed. Mariana stood tall, her heart pounding. And now? Nick closed the laptop with a decisive snap. Now, we stop hiding. The day of the meeting arrived. Nick stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his suit. It had been years since he'd worn it. His hair was freshly styled, and his ID badge, reactivated using a loophole he had created, was clipped to his jacket. Mariana, too, was ready. She wore a hidden camera, disguised as a shirt button. The plan was simple: Nick would enter as an investor, and Mariana, already scheduled to assist with the meeting logistics, would be there to support him. They met at the hotel entrance, the air thick with tension. "Are you ready?" Nick asked, his voice low. Mariana nodded. "Let's end this." The hall was packed with important figures when they arrived. Victor wasn't there yet, but the directors from the shell companies were seated around a large, oval table. Mariana moved among them, handing out materials, adjusting cables, and making everything appear normal. Then, finally, Victor walked in. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. "Gentlemen," Victor began, his voice smooth. "Today, we take an important step forward. And for that, I have the pleasure of introducing a new partner." Nick entered from the side, his footsteps measured and deliberate. The impact was immediate. Eyes widened. A whispered conversation rippled through the crowd. One of the directors turned pale. Victor froze, his composure cracking. "This can't be." Nick walked calmly to the front of the room. "Good to see you again, Victor." "This is trespassing," Victor spat. "You're impersonating someone else." Nick didn't flinch. "No. I'm reclaiming who I am. Nick Allen, founder of Harvan. And the victim of a fraud that starts with you." The room was still. Some people were too stunned to move. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nick pointed to Mariana, standing confidently by the screen. "Everything is recorded. Every meeting. Every call. Every misstep." Mariana activated the live broadcast. The screens around the room flickered to life, displaying the audio files, the voices, the proof. Victor's face twisted in panic. "This is fake. It's manipulated." But no one believed him. Nick reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Court order," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Freezing all assets linked to Harvan's shell companies, and you, Victor." As the envelope hit the table, the door to the room opened, and police officers entered. The game was over. Victor sat there, handcuffed, with no resistance left in him. The quiet hum of the room seemed to echo in his ears, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, never left Nick. With one final glance, Victor spoke, his voice bitter and laced with defiance. "You think you've won? You haven't. Not yet. The truth will come for you." His words lingered in the air like a promise, but they meant nothing now. Nothing would ever be the same for Victor again. As the police officers led him away, his head hung low, the man who had once seemed unstoppable now reduced to a mere shadow of his former self. Mariana and Nick sat on her apartment balcony later that night. The city lights stretched out before them, but the peace of the moment was overshadowed by the weight of what had just happened. Mariana broke the silence, her voice soft, almost uncertain. "Did you get what you wanted?" Nick turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Almost," he answered, his voice distant. He looked at her, his eyes searching. There's still one thing left. Mariana raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. Nick leaned in slowly, his fingers brushing against hers. I want you back, he whispered, the words quiet but full of meaning. Not as the CEO. Not as the guy from the alley. I want you back as someone who finally understands what it means to trust. Mariana smiled faintly, her fingers tightening around his. Then start, she said, her voice carrying more than just a challenge. It was an invitation to rebuild everything from the ground up. And in that moment, Nick felt like the game had finally changed. Victor's downfall had been a relief, yes, but it hadn't brought the freedom Nick had hoped for. The media had exploded with headlines about the scandal. Nick's name was once again in the spotlight, but this time, as the CEO who'd returned from the dead. Some investors celebrated his comeback, seeing it as a sign of resilience. Others, however, feared what his return might mean: uncertainty, instability. But for Nick, the opinions of others didn't matter anymore. Not when there was an uncomfortable silence between him and Mariana, a silence that seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. That night, they sat at the dinner table together, and Mariana's plate lay untouched. Her eyes were focused on the food in front of her, but her thoughts were far away. Finally, she broke the silence. Do you still think you did the right thing? She asked, her voice quiet but sharp. Nick hesitated, then replied, I did what had to be done. Mariana looked up, her eyes searching his face. Even knowing that now, everything revolves around you again, she pressed, her tone tinged with bitterness. Nick sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. Do you think I enjoy this? I don't know what you enjoy anymore, Nick, Mariana said, her voice filled with hurt. I don't even know if I know you. Her words cut deeper than he expected. It stung more than he was willing to admit. He had thought that by fixing the company, by doing what was necessary, things would fall into place. But they hadn't. Not yet. I'm the same man you found in that alley, Nick said quietly, almost as if pleading for her to understand. No, Mariana replied, her voice growing cold. You're not the man I found. The man I found gave me food when he had nothing. The man sitting here now hides things from me. He calculates every move like the world is a chessboard. But now, I'm wondering where I fit into this game. Nick didn't answer. There were no easy answers. Not for this. The next day, Mariana found herself walking through the cold, sterile halls of Harvin once again. It was the first time since the scandal that she had set foot in the company. Nick had asked her to accompany him to a board meeting where he would present his restructuring plans. As she stepped into the towering building, her eyes quickly scanned the familiar surroundings, the smell of polished floors and expensive furniture heavy in the air. She noticed the receptionist glance at her, then whisper something to the security guard. Mariana pretended not to notice, but her heart quickened. In the elevator, Nick adjusted his tie, his reflection in the polished steel doors showing the nerves she knew he wasn't letting on. Nervous? She asked, her voice betraying her own tension. I've always been nervous, Nick replied, a faint smile touching his lips. But Mariana could see the storm beneath. The weight of what he was about to do, the responsibility that hung over him, had never felt heavier. The meeting was brief, and Nick presented his plan with his usual confidence. He spoke of transparency, of independent audits, of revising contracts and giving opportunities to young talent. It was all perfect on paper. But Mariana's mind was elsewhere. She watched Nick, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind the polished facade he wore. As they stepped out of the meeting, she turned to him. You're very good at this, she said, her tone neutral. At what? Nick asked, genuinely curious. At speaking well, Mariana said. At convincing people. Nick understood immediately what she meant. He frowned. You think I'm manipulating you? No, Mariana said, her arms folding across her chest. I think you've gotten used to controlling everything. Everything around you. Your words, your actions. Everything. Nick didn't reply. The silence that fell between them was thick. As they walked toward the front desk to retrieve her phone, Nick's mind raced. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His instincts were screaming at him, warning him that he wasn't out of the woods yet. When he got back to his office, a security guard discreetly approached him. "Mr. Alliner," the guard said, "a man was here last night. Left this for you, but didn't identify himself." The guard handed Nick a thin envelope. No return address. Inside, Nick found a single photo, Mariana, entering a building. And a handwritten note, with chilling words, "How far is she with you?" Nick's stomach turned. He could feel the old tension creeping back into his chest. That night, Nick didn't come home until after 2 a.m. Mariana had been waiting up, her anxiety eating at her. When he finally walked in, his eyes were bloodshot, his face haggard from exhaustion. "Where were you?" Mariana asked, her voice tight with frustration. "I needed to think. About everything. About how all of this is affecting you," Nick replied, his words weighed down by guilt. "What do you mean?" "You think disappearing helps?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Nick sat down, his body sagging with fatigue. "Someone sent me a threat," he said quietly, his voice full of tension. "A photo of you." Mariana's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" she whispered. "They're trying to plant doubt," Nick explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Make me suspicious of you." "Did it work?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "No," Nick said firmly, shaking his head. "But it made me realize how exposed we are. How dangerous this is." Mariana stood and walked over to him, her steps slow but deliberate. "I'm not going anywhere, Nick. Not unless you push me away." Nick looked up at her, the weight of everything crashing down on him. "I would never do that." "Then tell me everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No more secrets." He hesitated for a long moment, then finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I have a false identity. Daniel Andrade. It's a name I created years ago, during a business trip to Dubai. I used it to move around, to sign documents, even to open accounts. It was for business, to make investors trust me." Mariana stood up, her hands trembling slightly. "You have accounts that aren't in your name?" "I did," Nick replied. "But everything was legalized when I came back. The name was just a shadow. And now someone is using it against me. Someone from inside." Mariana crossed her arms. "You need to report this." "I can't," Nick said, his voice strained. "If I admit there was a false identity linked to me, they'll use it to ruin my credibility." "Then find proof," she urged him, her voice sharp. "Before they use it against you." Nick nodded. 2 days later, Mariana received another anonymous envelope, this time at a cafe she frequented. Inside was a copy of a stock transfer document under the name Daniel Andrade. Nick's name wasn't on it anywhere. A note was included, "Do you still believe you know him?" Mariana felt her stomach drop. The weight of the truth was unbearable. That afternoon, she didn't call Nick ahead. She simply waited for him outside the building and intercepted him in the parking lot. "Is this yours?" she asked, handing him the envelope. Nick recognized it instantly. "Who gave you this?" "The same way it got to me," she replied. "It's part of what I warned you about. Someone's trying to break the trust between us." "Is it working?" Nick asked quietly. "Only if you let it," Mariana said, her arms crossed. "But why didn't you ever tell me about this past? About this other name?" "It was a mistake," Nick explained. "A mistake I buried. I thought it would never come back. Mariana's eyes narrowed. You can't expect me to believe everything without questioning it. Nick, you disappeared for months. Lied about who you were. Sneaked into parties with fake badges. And now there are documents with names I've never even heard before. I have the right to doubt you. Nick lowered his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. You're right. You do. So, do we keep going? She asked softly. Or do we stop here? Nick stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. I don't want to lose you. But I also don't want you by my side without knowing where you stand. Mariana looked at him for a long time, and then she spoke. Then show me everything, she said firmly. Tonight. That night, Nick took Mariana to a small warehouse in the suburbs, a place he'd kept hidden from everyone. There, he revealed the truth. Every document, every receipt, every contract. All the pieces of his past. He laid it all out before her. This is the part of my life I've been hiding, he said quietly. Not because I wanted to deceive you. But because I was ashamed. Mariana scanned the papers, the weight of the truth settling over her. All of this is yours? She asked. Yes, Nick replied, his voice thick with emotion. A part of my life no one knows about. Just me, and now you. For a moment, Mariana just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, as the silence stretched, the fear inside her slowly melted away. You're not perfect, she said softly. But at least now you're real. Nick let out a long breath, a weight lifting from his chest. This is the closest to the truth I can get. Mariana stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. Without hesitation, Nick closed his eyes, finally feeling the weight of the world ease, if only just a little. Finally, Nick realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe before: he didn't have to run anymore. The weight of that truth settled into him, a strange, liberating sensation that, for once, made him feel at peace. But somewhere, far across the city, in a small, dimly lit office, a man was watching everything unfold on a screen. The man's eyes never left the monitor, and a soft smile crept onto his face as he muttered, "They're together again," as though the world were following a script he wrote. His assistant, who stood behind him, didn't raise his eyes from the floor. Should I move forward with Harvin's next phase, bringing its CEO back into the market? The assistant asked quietly. The man turned his head slightly, nodding. Yes. Let's see how it plays out. As this was unfolding, Mariana stayed away from the noise. The headlines, the reporters, the flashing lights, they were all a distant world she didn't want to reconnect with. She didn't read the articles, didn't click on the videos that constantly mentioned Nick's name. The man they were talking about, the one who wore expensive suits, who greeted people with a professional handshake in sleek boardrooms, wasn't the Nick she remembered. The Nick she missed, the one she still longed for, was the one who laughed at his own cooking mistakes, who stayed up late rearranging her books by theme instead of by author, the one who didn't carry the weight of a corporation on his shoulders. But even though she tried to let go, a part of him was everywhere. The memories lingered like a shadow that she couldn't shake off. One afternoon, when the weather seemed as gray as her mood, Mariana decided to take a walk. She didn't have a destination in mind, nor did she bring an umbrella. The sky was overcast, the chill of the wind biting at her skin, but she kept walking, letting her feet guide her through streets she knew well. Some were familiar, places she had passed 1,000 times, and others, streets she had tried to avoid, memories she didn't want to face. And then, as if guided by fate, her steps took her back to the alley where it all began. The very spot where she had dropped her lunch, the same alley where she had met Nick, the man who had, in the strangest of ways, changed her life forever. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She wasn't smiling just because of the memory, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, she finally felt like she could move forward, even without him there. But as she stood in the alley, staring at the ground where it all began, she realized something. The universe wasn't quite done with them yet. Across the city, in a car parked on the side of a quiet street, Nick sat staring out the window. His eyes were locked on the Harvan building. It now stood as a symbol of rebuilding not just for the company but for himself as well. He had let go of it. Left it in the hands of a new board with a team he trusted, determined to make things right. He wasn't there anymore. The business world he had been so deeply involved in felt like a different life now. "Are you sure about this?" Marcos, sitting beside him in the back seat, asked, breaking the silence. Nick turned his gaze from the Harvan building and smiled softly. "Yes. I've closed that chapter." His eyes softened, a weight lifting off his shoulders. "Now, I need to find a coffee shop." The following week, Mariana received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Invitation to participate in internal selection process at Sunite Technologies." The email stated that her experience had been recommended for a potential position with them. The offer seemed legitimate, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with her. She had never heard of Sunite before. The address provided was in a rural area where many small startups had begun setting up operational offices. After thinking about it, Mariana decided to go, mostly out of curiosity. Saturday came, and she caught a bus, then a rideshare, and finally arrived at the location, a small road lined with trees. She glanced at the simple sign reading, Café Dole, and felt a strange, unsettled feeling. Checking the address again, she wondered if this was really the right place. It was odd. There was no reception area, no obvious signs of the company she was supposed to meet. Instead, there was just a young woman behind the counter, smiling warmly at her. "Mariana?" the woman asked, her voice friendly. "Yes," Mariana replied hesitantly. "Please follow me," the woman said. Mariana followed her through a small door at the back of the cafe. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting soft beams across the space. And there, in the middle of it all, was Nick. But he wasn't wearing a suit or a tie. He wore jeans, and his sleeves were rolled up. The man who had once been the CEO of a corporation, who had been consumed by his role, now looked different. He looked real. And that smile? She would recognize it anywhere. Mariana froze. "What is this? An apology?" Nick stood up, his expression soft but sincere. "You set all this up?" "Not alone," Nick answered. "The cafe is real, and so is the job offer. But the idea was to see you again. I didn't want to just show up at your door like a ghost." Mariana crossed her arms, not sure how to process it all. "And why now?" she asked, her voice tight with emotion. "Why now, after everything?" Nick took a deep breath before responding. "Because now I've settled everything I needed to. And because I still love you. Even if I don't know if you'll forgive me." Mariana's chest tightened, a mix of confusion and longing. "You left me without a word. You didn't even tell me if you were coming back. And now you think an invitation is enough to fix all of that?" Nick's eyes softened. "I know. I know it's not that simple. But maybe it can start with a coffee." Mariana laughed incredulously, shaking her head. "You never change." "I don't want to," he said earnestly. "Not if it means losing what brought me here." The silence between them grew heavy as Mariana took in his words. She studied him, her heart racing. She couldn't deny that part of her, maybe the bigger part, was glad to see him. To see this side of him again. "Okay, so what now?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Nick's smile widened, and he motioned toward the counter. "Well, if you say yes, I'll hand you an apron." Mariana took a moment to process it. The familiar, comforting smell of coffee surrounded them. The warmth of the cafe seeped into her. "And if I say no?" she asked with a smile of her own. You get a free coffee, Nick replied with a wink, and leave with your dignity intact. Mariana looked around once more, the soft light, the quiet buzz of the place, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this could be a new start. Slowly, she walked toward him, her heart racing, not knowing exactly what would happen next, but trusting, for the first time in a long while, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As she reached him, she stopped just inches away. "Do you have sugar?" she asked with a small grin. "We do," he said, his eyes lighting up. "We even have plant-based milk." Mariana raised an eyebrow. "Then what's today's special, boss?" Nick leaned in, his voice soft but playful. "The house specialty. New beginnings." With a deep breath, Mariana took the apron he offered and put it on. Slowly, she adjusted the straps and tied them securely. And just like that, something shifted. She felt something within her, something that had been missing for so long, fall into place. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But in this moment, in this cafe, with Nick by her side, Mariana felt like she was finally exactly where she was meant to be. As they prepared the first coffee of the day together, a woman on the other side of the world was reading an email with keen interest. The subject line read, "Target identified. CEO no longer active. Minimal market influence, but emotionally vulnerable." She typed just 2 words in response. "Keep watching." The game wasn't over. Not yet. But for Mariana and Nick, they were finally ready to play together. Nick sat there, his body still, but his mind racing. He knew that the truth had to come out, that there were no more secrets between him and Mariana. His heart was heavy as he took a deep breath, the weight of everything he was about to say hanging in the air. Slowly, he began, his voice steady but filled with the emotion he had tried so hard to hide. "When I came back from Victor's exhibition," Nick started, his eyes darkening at the memory, "I thought staying away would be enough. I thought that if I kept my distance, if I let the world think I was gone for good, maybe things would settle. But as soon as the press found out I was alive, everything reignited. The investors started calling, the board summoned me, and no matter how hard I tried to refuse, I realized that Harvin wasn't just some company I could walk away from. It was my responsibility." Mariana listened to him in silence, her gaze unwavering. The truth he was telling her was both a revelation and a heartbreak. She had known there was more to the story, but hearing it in his words was different. "So, you came back as an interim CEO?" she asked, her voice soft but piercing. Nick nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "Yes, but I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to make it look like I was taking control again. My plan was simple: settle the pending contracts, hand over the company to trustworthy hands, and then leave for good." Mariana's lips tightened as she processed his words. "And you didn't tell me, Nick." "Why not?" "Because I knew you'd think I was doing it all over again," he confessed, his voice rough with regret. "I knew you'd see me as the same man who disappeared without a word, the man who controlled everything. But I was just trying to make things right, to fix the mess I left behind." Mariana's heart clenched. She had never stopped caring for him, but his silence, his secrecy, had hurt her more than he could ever understand. "Do you still think you can live between 2 worlds?" she asked, the question hanging heavy between them. Nick's expression softened, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't hesitate before he answered. "I just want one of them to be with you." The air between them felt thick with unspoken feelings, but Mariana didn't know how to respond. She wanted to believe him, but the truth was, she had been hurt so many times before. Could she trust him again? The day of the hearing arrived faster than either of them expected. The courtroom was packed, the tension in the air palpable as reporters and lawyers alike filled the seats. Mariana sat in the reserved row for witnesses, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her mind racing. She hadn't seen Nick since the preliminary hearing, and the silence between them had only made the pain sharper. Nick walked into the courtroom beside his lawyer, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of familiarity. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't changed. The determination, the weight of responsibility, it was all still there. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everything he had built. On the other side of the courtroom, Victor was sitting with a smug look on his face, his posture confident, as if he believed he had the upper hand. He had hired a new team of lawyers at the last minute, and his smile suggested that he thought he still had one last card to play. But Nick knew better. The judge opened the session, and the prosecution wasted no time in laying out its arguments. They painted Nick as a man who had used a false identity, who had moved around in disguise, attending private events with hidden agendas. They accused him of being part of a dark scheme, something bigger than just corporate mismanagement, and they wanted to know whether it had all been part of an elaborate plan or simply an act of survival. When Mariana was called to the stand, she took a deep breath and stood up, walking to the front with measured steps. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the reporters, the lawyers, all waiting to hear what she had to say. The judge looked at her expectantly. "Miss Mariana," the judge asked, "what can you tell us about the time Mr. Nick was absent from the public eye?" Mariana paused, her thoughts racing. She hadn't spoken about this in front of anyone, and yet here she was, forced to reveal the truth of what she had known all along. She took another breath and spoke, her voice steady but full of emotion. "He was trying to save his own life," she said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything they had been through. "And later, the company he built." The room was silent, waiting for her next words. The judge's gaze was fixed on her, studying her closely. "Did you know he was using a false identity?" the judge asked. "I found out later," Mariana replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I understood why. He was betrayed, hunted, discredited. And even with everything that happened, he chose to fix things. He didn't disappear. He didn't seek revenge. He chose to make things right." A lawyer for Victor stood up then, his voice sharp and accusing. "At any point, did Mr. Nick coerce you? Did he manipulate your decisions? Convince you to help him in illegal acts?" Mariana's chest tightened at the question, but she didn't flinch. "No," she said firmly, her eyes meeting Nick's for the first time since she had taken the stand. "Everything I did was because I believed in him." The lawyer tried to press her further, but the question hung in the air, unanswered. Then the next question came, more pointed than before. "Do you still believe in him today?" Mariana's heart skipped a beat as she looked at Nick. He was watching her with an intensity she hadn't expected, as if that one answer would determine everything. She looked at him, her eyes searching for something she couldn't quite define. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. "I do." The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the judge nodded, considering her testimony. By the end of the hearing, the judge hadn't delivered a final ruling yet, but it was clear where the case was heading. Nick had acted outside the legal parameters, yes, but his actions were driven by the need to protect himself and the company he had spent years building. The prosecution's argument of fraud and intentional identity manipulation had failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed Mariana, throwing questions at her from all directions. "Are you with him now?" they asked. "Is he really the man who disappeared? What is it like to be with someone with two identities?" Mariana paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The questions came fast, but she had prepared herself for this. With a deep breath, she smiled and answered, "He has two names, but only one heart. And that's what matters." A few meters away, Nick stood, watching her with a sense of quiet relief. Her words had given him something he hadn't expected, hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been broken. The morning of the trial was cold and gray. There was no rain, but the sky seemed to carry the weight of unshed tears. Nick knew this could be the end of the line, but he tried to make himself ready. He wore the same suit he had worn when he first took over Harvin, the suit that had once made him feel invincible. But now, it felt like a shroud, a reminder of everything he had lost. Mariana wasn't with him. She hadn't been since the preliminary hearing. She had spoken little, only saying the night before, "If you need me, you know where to find me." But now, she wasn't in the witness bench, and she hadn't answered his calls. Nick entered the courtroom, his head held high, though his heart felt heavy. On the other side, Victor sat with a smug smile, surrounded by his new team of lawyers. He seemed confident, almost like someone who knew the game wasn't over yet. But Nick wasn't looking at Victor. His eyes searched the room, hoping to find one face, one familiar smile. But Mariana wasn't there. The session started promptly, the first few hours filled with debates over legal terms and technicalities. Nick listened in silence, his thoughts far away. He didn't argue. He didn't gesture. He just waited, hoping for the moment when he could speak. Finally, when his name was called, Nick walked to the center of the room, standing before the microphone. He cleared his throat and spoke calmly, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "During the time I was absent, my priority was to protect what was left of my company," he said. "Yes, I used a false name. Yes, I entered events in disguise. Yes, I acted outside the protocol. But every step I took was to prevent a bigger crime." The judge watched him closely, his expression unreadable. "Do you acknowledge that you violated corporate and legal regulations?" Nick nodded, his gaze steady. "I acknowledge that, but I ask the court to consider the context. The real risk. The evidence shows that my actions were driven by a need to protect, not to deceive." The prosecution didn't object. Victor's defense tried to shift the focus, but the evidence presented during the trial was undeniable. After a brief recess, the judge returned to deliver the verdict. The court acknowledged that Nick had acted outside legal parameters, but his actions had been driven by a need to protect himself and his company. The judge declared him not guilty of fraud and identity manipulation. For the first time, Victor's smile faded. The judge's decision was clear. Nick had won. But it wasn't a victory, not entirely. It was freedom, a chance. Nick had decided, after all the chaos, to lead a quieter life, but not one that was lonely. It was a choice he had made, a choice to give back to the community through small social projects, especially those focused on education. He had left behind the grand, bustling world of business for something simpler. The rhythm of the mornings felt like a breath of fresh air. He had become involved in small-scale endeavors, helping those who wanted to learn, sharing what he had learned himself over the years. Life, he realized, wasn't about controlling everything anymore. It was about finding a place to belong. Mariana, too, had changed. She opened a small bookstore in a quiet neighborhood, a peaceful space dedicated to the love of reading. The bookstore was more than just a place to buy books, it became a sanctuary for the people in the town. It had a warmth to it, the kind that made people linger, made them want to stay longer. And for Mariana, it was more than just a business, it was a new chapter in her life. A place where she could breathe freely, where the world didn't feel so heavy. They hadn't seen each other in months, but their thoughts had often crossed paths, like faint whispers carried by the wind. They each lived their lives, healing, changing, and growing. Neither of them had sought out the other. It wasn't about running away or being pulled back into something they couldn't escape. But life, it seemed, had other plans. Then one spring morning, Mariana's peaceful world was interrupted when a letter arrived at her bookstore. She hadn't expected it, didn't even realize it would affect her so much. The envelope was simple, unmarked, and had only one letter written on it, D. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling just slightly as she read the words inside. "I found a town where the trees bloom all year long, where the coffee never gets cold, and where there's an empty chair beside mine. If you ever want to come back, I'll be here." She read it again, a smile pulling at the corners of her lips. It had been months since she had heard from him, and yet the letter seemed to echo in the silence of her little bookstore. It wasn't just the words, it was the promise behind them. A promise of a place that wasn't about pressure or duty but simply about being together. And for the first time in a long while, Mariana felt no rush. No anxiety about what to do next. She had changed. She had healed. The reunion would come, she knew that. But it would come when they were both ready to stay. And right now, they both needed time. Time to breathe. Time to be whole on their own. Nick had woken up that morning with a restless feeling gnawing at him. He couldn't place it. He didn't know what had triggered it, but something was different today. He could feel it in the air, like the world was waiting for something. He tried to shake off the feeling, moving through his morning routine at the cafe. The small, cozy cafe he had created with his own hands had grown into something beautiful. It was a space where people came to find peace. The regulars had started to call it Dentino Cafe, as if it had become a part of the town itself, a part of their everyday lives. As he moved around the cafe, checking on the coffee beans, cleaning the espresso machine, and setting the tables just right, he felt something, an expectation, perhaps, that today was different. The flower vase by the window was fresh, the chairs set in a welcoming way, and the small wooden sign outside the cafe swayed slightly in the morning breeze. He was waiting. But for what? Mariana, on the other hand, felt a strange excitement building up in her chest as she made her way toward the town. It wasn't as familiar as it used to be, or maybe it was just that she was seeing it through different eyes, eyes that had learned to appreciate the beauty in simplicity. She carried little with her, a backpack, a notebook, and, of course, the letter Nick had written. She had kept it close to her all this time, reading it over and over again. She had never responded, not because she didn't want to but because she needed to make sure she was ready, not just for him but for herself. As she reached the town, she took in the familiar smells, the scent of old books, fresh pastries, and coffee drifting on the breeze. It was a town that lived slowly, peacefully. The streets were narrow, the houses small but full of life. It was different than the busy city life she had once known. Everything here seemed to have its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. And it was in this town that she realized she had been searching for something she hadn't known she needed. She had arrived. The small sign outside the cafe made her smile. Dentino Cafe. It was hand-painted, simple yet inviting. She pushed the door open slowly, the little bell above the door jingling softly. Nick appeared from behind the counter, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other, their gazes locking, both of them feeling the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still yet to come. Nick's voice broke the silence. "You came." Mariana smiled, the smile soft, but full of meaning. "Took me too long." He chuckled softly. "No, right on time." Mariana walked up to the counter, a sense of calm washing over her. The familiar scent of coffee filled the air. She glanced around, taking in the cozy, simple atmosphere of the cafe. It was just as she had imagined. A place to be free, a place to find peace. "You really did it," she said, her voice soft with awe. "A coffee shop in the middle of nowhere?" Nick's smile was genuine. "Sometimes, we don't need much. Just a place to call home." "And did you find it?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Not yet," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I'm close." He gestured to a chair on the other side of the counter, and Mariana sat down. "What's good today?" she asked, a playful glint in her eyes. "The house coffee's still strong," he said, "and the neighbor makes fresh cheese bread." Mariana's face lit up. "Cheese bread?" Nick's smile deepened. "You sure know how to win me over." He leaned in a little, his voice dropping. "I learned from the best." Mariana couldn't help but laugh. You were never desperate, Nick. Not really. Only on the inside. They sat there for a while, each with a cup of coffee, talking about everything and nothing. The day unfolded around them like a slow, peaceful melody. It wasn't about grand declarations or promises of forever, it was about being together in the now, in the moment. They were no longer running, no longer hiding. They had found something real, something steady. You've changed, Mariana said after a while, her voice full of admiration. For the better. Nick nodded, his eyes softening. For the truth. And you? He asked. Did you change? Mariana paused, thinking. I stopped running, she said quietly. Stopped hiding. But I had to step away from everything to understand who I was without you. And yes, I did find that answer. She looked at him then, her eyes full of something deeper than words could explain. But now, I also know who I am with you around. Nick set his coffee cup down slowly. I don't know if I still have the right to ask for anything, but, his voice trailed off, unsure. Mariana looked at him, her gaze steady. But you're going to ask. If I asked you to stay, just for a few days, would you consider it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mariana didn't answer right away, and when she finally did, it was with a soft smile. I packed enough clothes for a week. Nick's grin was wide. I can get you an apron. She reached across the counter, taking his hand in hers. I already feel at home, she whispered. In the days that followed, Mariana was an integral part of the cafe. She helped with the register, rearranged the bookshelves, and even created a small reading nook in the corner of the cafe where customers could relax with their coffee. Nick watched it all quietly, his heart swelling with pride. They didn't have to prove anything anymore. They didn't have to save each other. They just walked side by side. One evening, as they were closing up the shop, one of the regulars, an old man with a white beard, commented, "You two have something special, you know? Like pieces of the same puzzle." Mariana smiled, her eyes glinting with affection. Maybe we are. Nick said nothing, but inside, he knew that it was true. And as the night fell, the quiet hum of the cafe settling around them, he realized that they had both found what they were looking for. Not in grand gestures or promises, but in quiet moments shared together. And so, life continued in the peaceful little town, where the trees bloomed year-round, where the coffee was always hot, and where the two of them had found their place. And that was enough. Nick was always full of surprises. That day, as the soft spring breeze swept through the small cafe, he had something special planned. He stood in the doorway, holding a bouquet of bright, golden sunflowers. Mariana, still getting used to how unexpected and simple things had become, raised an eyebrow, unsure of what this was about. Is this nothing special? She asked, her voice teasing but curious. You'll see, Nick replied with a twinkle in his eye, his voice steady. He walked to the door, which was open to let in the mild weather, and gently placed the bouquet on one of the tables outside on the porch. He turned and extended his hand to her. Come with me, Mariana. Just for 5 minutes. She hesitated for a moment, but something in his expression made it impossible to resist. She followed him, her heart thumping lightly in her chest. She had no idea what he was up to, but she trusted him, and somehow, she had learned to expect the unexpected with him. As soon as Mariana stepped outside, she stopped dead in her tracks. What she saw took her breath away. In the garden, now decorated with delicate banners fluttering in the breeze and lights hanging from the branches like tiny stars, stood a crowd of familiar faces. Her neighbors, her friends, even the loyal customers of the cafe, everyone was there, smiling, waiting. Her eyes darted back to Nick, who had that same calm smile, but his eyes were glowing with excitement. What is this? She asked, her voice shaky from both shock and something else she couldn't quite name. Nick's gaze softened, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down around them. He took a deep breath, his voice warm and filled with something more than just words. It's our day. Mariana's heart skipped a beat. Our, what? Before she could process, Nick knelt down on one knee right there, on the damp morning grass. Mariana felt the world blur around her, the sound of her breathing filling her ears. He looked up at her, his expression full of raw sincerity. Mariana, you were the most unexpected and perfect thing that ever happened to me, he said softly, the words heavy with emotion. You showed up when I was nothing but ruins, and had the courage to rebuild me with patience. I don't want to live without you anymore. I can't even imagine days where you're not by my side, arguing with me because I forgot to put sugar in your coffee. Mariana's eyes filled with tears at the simple, beautiful thought of their days together, all those small, intimate moments that made up their love. He smiled, his voice shaking just slightly as he continued, so, I ask you, with everything I have and everything I am. Will you marry me? Mariana's breath caught in her throat. She covered her mouth with her hand, stunned. Are you serious? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. More than anything I've ever done in my life, he replied, his eyes never leaving hers, steady, sure. Her heart beat faster as everything seemed to rush forward, and she felt as though the entire world had led up to this moment. The world around her faded, and all she could see was Nick. The man who had stood beside her, who had fought for their love, who had loved her through every storm. When is the wedding? She asked, almost breathless. Nick's smile grew even wider, and his eyes sparkled. Right now. Mariana was speechless, caught in the whirlwind of emotions. Her world had shifted, and it felt like she was standing at the edge of something beautiful, something life-changing. Nick stood up, his hands gently lifting hers. I know this is unexpected, but everything is ready. Simple. Just like us. There's only one thing missing. What's that? She whispered, her heart racing. Your answer, Nick said softly. Mariana looked around, at the lights, at the familiar faces of friends and neighbors who had become family, at the garden they had nurtured together. Then, she looked back at Nick, her heart full. I do, she said, her voice steady but full of love. The crowd erupted into applause, and Mariana's smile was as bright as the sunflowers that had started it all. Pedro, one of the regulars, began playing a soft tune on his guitar. Anna, the neighbor, appeared with a carrot cake topped with chocolate frosting, their favorite. Mariana laughed, overwhelmed by the warmth of the moment. The ceremony was quick, light-hearted, and intimate, much like the love that had blossomed between them. A local justice of the peace officiated with a gentle humor that had everyone laughing. Nick and Mariana exchanged vows with such tenderness, looking into each other's eyes as though the world around them didn't matter. I promise to remind you who you are, even when you forget, Mariana said, her voice full of emotion. And I promise to protect you, even if the world crumbles again, Nick replied, his voice firm but full of love. The kiss that followed was soft, slow, unhurried, as though every moment of their story had led to this, every moment of pain and beauty having found its perfect ending. Later that afternoon, the café was filled with life. The tables had been moved aside, and the space had turned into an impromptu dance floor. Children ran around with napkins tied around their necks like capes, laughing and playing. The adults toasted with cups of coffee, some topped with whipped cream, some with a sprinkle of chocolate, all raised in celebration of the new chapter in Nick and Mariana's life. Mariana sat by the window, her eyes misting over as she watched it all. The joy around her felt like a dream, something so surreal she could hardly believe it was real. Nick sat beside her, holding a cup of coffee in his hands. What are you thinking about? He asked, his voice quiet. For a long time, Mariana began, her voice soft, I thought there were only two choices in life, survive, or give up. And now, here I am. Living. Nick smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. You always knew how to live, Mariana. You just needed space. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a soft sigh escaping her lips. And you? Are you happy? More than I deserve, Nick said, his voice full of sincerity. You do deserve it, Nick, Mariana replied, looking at him, her heart full. Because you chose to change. You chose to love. And more than anything, you chose to stay. Later that evening, when the last of the guests had gone home, and the sounds of laughter and music had faded, Mariana and Nick sat once again at the counter of the cafe. The room was quiet now, lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp in the corner. You know what I was thinking? Mariana said, stirring her spoon in her empty cup, her voice thoughtful. What? Nick asked, curious. Maybe it's time to change the cafe's name, she said, looking up at him with a glint in her eyes. Change it? He asked, surprised. Not entirely, just a little, she added, already getting up and grabbing a sheet of paper. She wrote something with a blue pen and slid it over to him. Nick read it aloud, a smile spreading across his face. Cafe and Heart. She smiled back at him, her eyes soft. What do you think? Nick laughed, a warm sound that filled the quiet space. It's exactly what we are. Mariana placed the paper on the counter, a feeling of peace settling over her. Tomorrow, we change the sign. Nick nodded, his voice full of quiet excitement. Tomorrow is a great day to start over. A few weeks later, the cafe had officially become Cafe and Heart, and it began to attract visitors from all over. People came to see the place where a former CEO had chosen to start his life over, with a woman who had the heart of a giant. They came for the story, the charm of the place, the small-town beauty. But inside, Nick and Mariana weren't a legend, they were just two people living a simple, quiet life. Nick made the coffee, Mariana managed the books, and they loved each other effortlessly. They had built a life based on patience, understanding, and most importantly, the quiet moments they shared together. They had learned that the real luxury in life wasn't in things or grand gestures, it was in having someone to share the silence with. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. We hope you enjoyed the story and felt every twist and turn along the way. If you loved it, don't forget to give us a rating, your feedback really means a lot to us. And if you'd like to see more stories like this, be sure to engage with our channel. Hit that like button, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Until next time, stay tuned for more heartwarming tales.